Hey community, welcome to our sermon podcast for wanderers, seekers, and thinkers, for deconstructing and reconstructing. This is a feed of Open Door Church, a faith community focused on God's love and grace, a progressive church built around action, community, and people. Enjoy this week's message and check back often as we're posting new content every week. We've been walking through Romans, and that's a bit of a loose term because we didn't actually start at the beginning, and we actually kind of started at the end, and then we jumped to the beginning, and then we just stalled for a little bit, and so we haven't really worked through much of Romans, but hopefully it's been helpful anyway. The first thing that we struggle with when we read Romans is that we read it in the context of someone's systematic theology. We name this every week, but we've all, or many of us, have heard of this the Roman road to salvation, where we walk through Romans and learn what salvation is and what we're supposed to do about it. And we read it as if that's what Paul was writing. Or we come from these two perspectives where we have this dichotomy between works-based religion and faith through grace-based religion, and we have this meeting ground that happens in Romans. And so we use it as this theological treatise about grace through faith. While you can find those things in Romans, that is not what Paul was doing. And because we've so narrowly focused our attention on those things, that's all we can get out of it. And it's really hard to move past it. So over the last, I don't know how many weeks we've been going, my thing says 7. Over the past 6 weeks then, we've been trying to undo some of that and trying to rewrite how we look at this. Some of the big pieces of things is that Romans was a letter. It was written to a church at a particular time in a particular place. I know that sounds weird to say out loud, but sometimes we have to remind people that actually this was written to people that were living in Rome, not just written, if that makes sense. It matters because what was going on in Rome changes the way we read the letter. What was going on in the churches in Rome changes the way we read the letter. Who brought the letter to Rome changes the way we read the letter. And it is monumental. It's a monumental shift when we look at Phoebe, who Paul has asked to deliver the letter, who has probably paid for the scribe to write the letter with Paul, who delivers the letter, whose name literally was changed by the church at times to reflect a male name, because it couldn't possibly be the case that a woman would have such authority to deliver this letter to the churches in Rome. But that was step 1 of Paul's subversive practice in sending this letter to the churches in Rome, was sending it through Phoebe, a woman. We talked a bit about this as we've gone along, but she literally would have presented it. She would have studied with him. She would have sat with him. She would have presented it like a theatrical kind of play where she speaks on behalf of Paul. And at the end of that, they would have gotten to ask her questions. And she would have been able to respond with the authority of Paul in answering those questions. Wouldn't that be nice? All that to say, we have consistently tried to undermine the purpose and the specifics of what Paul was doing in the letter to Rome. The second big piece of Romans that we've identified historically is that it's written to churches in Rome that are split. We have some churches that are Greek or Gentile churches that have with them the, shall we say, like social authority or the economic and cultural authority to lead and to be in charge of things. So there's a socioeconomic status at play in between these two types of churches. And then Jewish Christians who literally had been exiled from the community a few years earlier and so all of their position within the church had been lost, had only recently come back. And Paul is writing to this church that is split down the line between Jewish and Gentile Christians. Some things come into play. We go, oh, first for the Jew and also for the Greek makes a difference. Now that we know, oh, this is written to a specific people, that there's a split, that they're both claiming authority, that they're both claiming power and privilege over the other, matters when we read this book. Scott McKnight wrote about it I think it was released earlier this year, his commentary on it, or a book on Romans, and he says, the entirety and the purpose and the drive of Romans is first and foremost about power and privilege. Did your church teach you that growing up? They didn't tell me that. We don't say privilege in Texas. So last week we talked about the imagination of Paul. And what is happening, what's occurring in this letter is Paul is taking the empire, the Roman Empire, and presenting language and images that takes language from the empire, subverts it, and rewrites it to show God's vision for the world, which is quite powerful. I don't want to go through everything, but I see a lot of faces that weren't here last week, and this is like a normal thing. Paul, a slave of Jesus Christ, called to be, and we're switching some words from most of your translations because they're more relevant to what Paul was actually trying to say. Paul, a slave of Jesus Christ, a slave has no honor in this society, has no privilege, is at the bottom of everything. He says, a slave, me, a slave of Jesus Christ, called to be an ambassador. Ambassador would have spoke just like today on behalf of the person in charge, set apart for the gospel of God. And gospel is also a political term that often was used when in battle they sent the good news back to the emperor to say, hey, guess what? We won. This is the gospel being taken. The victory is ours and the gospel is taken. Every single thing that Paul does in the first 17 verses of Romans has a political language built into it. And he is subverting the dynamic of honor and shame and power and privilege by telling this story through the story of Jesus, who shamefully died on a cross as a criminal, as an enemy of the empire. The empire who is literally seen as saving people and creating the good life. So we do all of that. That's all background. We're okay? So last week we were like, okay, what does imagination look like if we don't have the ability to envision or to imagine or to come up with those creative ways or alternative ways of viewing the world around us so that God's story or God's vision for harmony and peace and shalom can infiltrate this community, then we lose what Paul is doing. And it's difficult because Paul is doing it, a long time ago. And our narratives, church and culture, have been intertwined for many, many years, hundreds of years. So I want to do a bit of identification this morning, and I'm going to ask for help. I have some things on here if we get stuck. As I mentioned, I grew up in Texas. We tell our own stories about our culture and our place and how we got there and who we are as Texans. You might have heard some of those stereotypes. But those live with me. Those cultural images and narratives live with me in the way I see the world. Forgive me, as an American. Those narratives live with me. And what Paul is doing in Romans is identifying those images and those cultural narratives and unraveling them and telling new stories and imagining a new way to live and be in the world. So, you're up. You ready? We are going to work, name, identify the stories that our culture tells us that lead us to live life in a specific way. Your value is your earning power. We're not going to ease into this. Okay, that's good. Time is money. Nice things mean success.
And conversely, if you don't have nice things, it's your own fault.
You've done something wrong. Or if you're in the church, God doesn't love you. Okay? Was that, okay. Our values determined by our beauty standards. Yeah. Okay, what are, so these are, I don't know, are these tropes or whatever? These are things that we internalize. Let's name some images that create these things. Anyone that's cool on TV has a nice car and a suit with a really skinny tie? There was a fascinating study done a year or two ago that looked at common Google searches versus social media posts, which we assume our Google searches are private. Just type in "my husband" and let Google fill out what the options are below that. I kid you not. It's so much fun. What else? I grew up with the image of a cowboy, the bootstraps. I had the bootstraps. They're beautiful. Black leather, some nice red suede up the top. That's not a joke.
Everything is thin, fit, athletic.
Yeah. Even our supermodels are airbrushed on our magazines, right? Yeah.
Polite Canadian?
What's that?
Polite Canadian images?
The polite Canadian? Yeah. I don't know if you've driven around here. That was a shock to my world when I got here. Keep going, this is fun. We can do this all morning.
There's probably a whole lot of Canadian-related stuff, we all like hockey, we all maple syrup, we all like poutine, we all say a boot.
Yeah. So we formulate through these things, we formulate specific images that make us Canadian. So the hockey playing, yes, thank you, creates a social identity that we're then supposed to carry out or resist or whatever. Okay, so I feel like Disney is somewhere in, and well, let's continue. We've named success as things and finances, but we watch TV shows and movies pretty much on a daily basis where the hero never loses, where the good guy is always wins. The good guy is always also a guy. Thank you. Yeah. And Disney's slowly trying to not do that, but they really just can't help it. Right. And so as go bring my American piece into things, part of what makes me think how I think about the world has to do with how I think about the mobility, the upward mobility of any individual person in terms of economic status in our society. The American dream, the idea that we were born out of resistance to the man. The story of the Alamo, does that get taught in your public schools here? We lost, but we killed 8-1 people in that battle because we're tough cowboys. Some of these are silly things, but they live deep inside us, and we tell stories about are heroes that don't lose. And we as believe that we're on the right side of history when we go to war. And we believe that we're looking up to the right people when we identify entrepreneurs and when we tell stories about success that includes money and space that we own. These are all part of the sort of cultural imaginary world that we live in, and it changes the way we think about things. Capitalism produces a specific narrative in the way we live out our lives, in the way we think about what we're going to do or who we're going to be. As we named, consumerism produces a specific narrative about who we are, about what value we have in our communities. But this is the world that we live in. Unfortunately, much of that world is shaped by our corporations and those that are earning money off of those stories. Disney tells stories for decades about women being saved by a great male hero. And as the demand for that changes economically, they change their storylines. They're not shifting our culture positively for the sake of shifting culture positively. Not to crush anyone's perspective here, but they have an economic interest in that storytelling. Say that again.
Don't we all have an economic interest? The point is how you are utilizing those economic means, right?
Yes.
So it's not about the means or the economic perspective. It's about who you are as a person and
Yeah.
the values you hold important.
I'll go with you on that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a shift that happens. So I'm sorry, it's just going to be like a USA Day, but in a time when our corporations are making more and more money and there's a greater disparity between the CEO and the rank and file workers that are doing out the work, like that number's growing larger and larger, right? Yeah, the gap in between is growing larger and larger, and which we would say, okay, well, it's fine to make a profit off of good, but when that profit is specific to someone who is making millions a year and not serving the broader community, there's a problem. I don't want to get on all of that. Sorry. There are issues. Anyway, all of that, I say all of that, we name all of that to say that there is this piece of our culture that we identify with and that we live out. And so I have a really hard time not identifying that pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of mentality. Like, I don't ask for help. I don't want to be the one in need. Like, that's deep in my psyche. And as much as I want to talk about, oh, we're going to go serve and help people out and lift people out of things, I don't want to be the one that needs that. Because that's deep in how I think about the world. That's a problem, right? There's a dichotomy in the way I think about the world and the way I want to understand myself. But that's how we do this. That's how deep these cultural imaginations live inside us. So before we go too far, I want to talk a little bit about church, because we're going to come back to that when we go, okay, well, what are we supposed to do about this? But I want to talk a little bit about church, because our churches have told remarkably similar stories as that of our culture. And this is the breakdown in our own social imaginary kind of place, is that we can't create church culture that doesn't fall in line with the broader culture. I'll give you an example. Okay, this is a really terrible example, but it's kind of fun. Okay, so this week, again, we're back in the States. My apologies. This is not every week. It's this week. This week, Politico reported, had this like month-long investigation where they looked at Jerry Falwell Jr. and Liberty University. This is the largest Christian university in the world. I think I've got that right. Don't fact check that. And this is the person in charge of it. And the story that they tell was quite fascinating. Like I just kind of like clicked it because it looked interesting, and I was like, but then I started reading, and it just goes on and on and on, and it includes this prominent evangelical leader in it, and it includes all of the great aspects of power and corruption. It just was fascinating. Consolidating power after the loss of a leader, the tremendous ability to line the pockets of yourself and others through the process of something that looks benign or good. Family, friends are part of that. The suppression of any kind of criticism within the university or outside of it. Power and control and greed, and like one person was quoted saying that, and I don't like intend to be like harsh with whatever, but they were quoted as saying, liberty is how do they put it, like a real estate investor under the guise of a university using the money paid by students. And it was just like year after year, they're buying property paid by the students. Anyway, it just went on and on and on, which, okay, there's two sides of every story. So he responded, and this is what I really want to look at. He responded in an interview with, I can't remember who, Charisma or something. He responds by contacting the FBI and preparing a civil action backup plan if the FBI doesn't want to follow suit, because these people are after him and liberty. And he says, turns out we pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Yep, call back. Never needed help from anyone after my father died, and they just couldn't handle that. So this is these, whoever that have responded to this article. And the article, I'm quoting from the article, Falwell admits that this course of action may not look like turning the other cheek to some people, but he believes Jesus taught that his followers must do what's in the best interests of the government or corporation that they are a part of. Okay, this is a quote. Are you ready? From Jerry Falwell Jr. When you deal with people personally, you have an obligation to love your neighbor as yourself. So this is not personal. This is corporate. And I believe in Jesus' teaching to do what's in the best interest of the corporation. Just like Donald Trump has a job to do, it's in the best interest of the nation. So that's my take on it all, and I'm glad to go to war. I just actually enjoy it, probably a little too much. So defends all of his actions, but then that's the thought process. When our cultural imagination about what success and power and systems are supposed to look like is infiltrates our church and our Christian and our theological imaginations, we have this mix between the two that we cannot pull out of. And so in the midst of this, he's going to say, yes, no, I didn't do anything. We're clean. Everything is fine. We've asked the FBI to look into this. And yet I have the best interest of a corporation because this is not personal. His theology has shifted to take on the cultural identity of power. Paul is doing the exact same thing. Paul is doing what we're trying to think about here, which is he looks at the empire, he looks at the world, he looks at power, he looks at the system of honor and shame, and some with privilege and some without, and he says, you have to undo all of that. We can't continue this. It has to be deeper that we dig into what the world is teaching us. When we support wealth and power, we rob ourselves from the gospel that was presented by Paul. Ultimately, we end up creating a faith that is more interested in our own self-dealing than in the salvation of our community. Last week, I showed you the Pineda Madrid book on suffering and salvation, Ciudad Juarez. What was so fascinating, so we talked about like the resistance and what they were doing and things that were going on culturally and the images that were used culturally. But then what we didn't get to is that where she goes with that is to say, when salvation comes communally, when we address things as Paul is attempting to do, not on an individual basis, but on a communal basis where everyone finds harmony with everyone else and with everything else, salvation looks different. Not for the self. Salvation is for the community. Okay, we took too much time. I have to cut some things here because it's time to go. My apologies. The church has taken on the same identity as the world around us. The problem, the complication is that we're used to this conversation. We're used to claiming victimhood and then going and doing the same thing. We have invented theology to combat the appropriate care of our land in the midst of global warming. We have invented theology to combat proper care of people that are on the margins. It is economically and politically advantageous for us to perpetuate narratives of power in our culture. As churches, we are happy to promote the self-identifying, persecuted narrative to name the war on Christmas because it's beneficial, in an attempt to speak truth to power, and then we turn around and use the same power to subjugate, marginalize, and oppress the truth of God. The truth of a world in which God's love, grace, and compassion is at the center of community, not at the center of the moral self. As Paul writes it, we have exchanged the truth of God for a lie. Put in proper context, that statement has real power to it. When the lie is success comes from your ability to earn in our culture, or your value comes from your physical beauty, or that the world needs saving by men, all of those things are the lie, and it's the reason that Paul writes, there is neither Jew nor Greek, nor male nor female, because he is undoing this system of power and privilege. And I'm going to cut this passage off, but therefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creature, the self, rather than the Creator. This is a conversation about empire and privilege, and we've made it about morality. Thanks for listening to this sermon podcast from Open Door Church. Our intro and outro music was created by Lee Rosevere and is used under a Creative Commons by attribution license. Have a great week. Ask the hard questions and explore God's love. Everyone is always welcome to join the journey with us at Open Door. Learn more at opendoorfamily.ca. That's opendoorfamily.ca.